he spotted a workman hard at work installing a speed bump. Peering down from his high horse, the Duke said, "What the F are you doing now?"
He spotted a workman installing a speed bump. Peering down from his horse, the Duke looked the man dead in the eye and said, "What the F are you doing now?" That single moment, witnessed by bystanders on a quiet summer morning in one of England's most serene royal estates, tells you almost everything you need to know about Prince Andrew. Not the version the palace spent decades carefully packaging and distributing to a largely willing press. Not the version that appeared in tailored suits at trade conferences and charity galas with a polished smile pinned firmly in place. The real one. The one that emerges when the cameras aren't supposed to be rolling and the people watching aren't supposed to matter. For most of his adult life, Prince Andrew, the Duke of York, second son of Queen Elizabeth II, traded on a particular image. War hero, trade ambassador, loyal royal. He served in the Falklands conflict aboard a helicopter, and for years that service acted as a kind of permanent shield, deflecting harder questions and softening sharper criticism. The palace understood the value of that shield and deployed it carefully. But shields only cover so much ground. And over the course of Andrew's life, enough moments have slipped through the gaps, caught by witnesses, leaked by staff, recorded by bystanders, and dragged into courtrooms, that a very different portrait has assembled itself piece by piece. Not a portrait of a flawed man trying his best, a portrait of a man who never quite believed the rules applied to him the way they applied to everyone else. 15 moments, each one a window. And together they form something the palace has spent years and enormous resources trying to prevent the public from seeing clearly. So let's start at the beginning of the most recent chapter, because it tells you exactly where things stand right now. Windsor Great Park is the kind of place that makes you understand why people fight wars over land. 5,000 acres of ancient forest, manicured paths, sweeping open fields, and the kind of silence that only exists when nature and privilege have been undisturbed long enough to settle into each other.
The scandal that's rocked the royal family to its core, Prince Andrew's relationship with convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein.
It sits in the shadow of Windsor Castle, and for centuries it has been a place of retreat for the royal family, a world where the noise of public life simply doesn't penetrate. Deer move through the morning mist. Horses clop slowly along bridle paths. Everything, in theory, moves at a pace that reflects the gravity and calm of the institution it belongs to. That was the backdrop on the morning Andrew spotted the speed bumps. Dozens of bright yellow and black bumps had been installed across the estate during that summer, including one positioned just steps from the front drive of Royal Lodge, the sprawling 31-room property Andrew has called home for years. They were placed there for entirely practical reasons. The park draws millions of visitors annually: cyclists, walkers, families with young children. The bumps were designed to slow vehicle traffic and reduce the risk of accidents. Nobody inside the Crown Estate thought twice about it. It was a routine safety measure, the kind of thing that gets approved, scheduled, and carried out without fanfare. Andrew set out on horseback that morning for what was meant to be a quiet private ride. He came across a workman installing one of the bumps on a path near his home. And something in him, something that seems to sit permanently close to the surface, ignited. From up on the horse, physically elevated above the man crouching over the tarmac, Andrew's voice cracked across the stillness. "What the F are you doing now?" Not a question, a condemnation. The workman, by all accounts, went rigid. Witnesses said there was a long, uncomfortable pause before anyone moved or spoke again. People nearby exchanged glances. No one seemed to know quite what to do with what they had just seen. When the story got out, the internet didn't hold back. But those who had watched Andrew closely over the years noted something important. Their reaction wasn't shock, it was recognition. They had seen this before. Because this wasn't even the first time a speed bump situation had pushed Andrew past his limits. Go back to 2016 and a set of sensor-controlled gates at Windsor Great Park, installed to manage traffic flow on the estate's internal roads. On a Sunday evening, rather than take the 1-mile detour required to reach Royal Lodge when the gates weren't responding, Andrew allegedly climbed into his Range Rover and drove straight through them. Not around them, through them. The gates were left badly damaged. The story spread fast across the UK press, picking up heat as it traveled. Buckingham Palace said nothing. The Crown Estate said nothing. That silence, carefully maintained and entirely deliberate, only amplified the noise outside. Graham Smith, the then head of Republic, the campaign group advocating for an elected head of state, formally wrote to Thames Valley Police requesting an investigation. His argument was straightforward. If an ordinary citizen had driven a vehicle through a set of gates on public land and caused significant damage, they would face a criminal inquiry. Andrew should face the same standard. Police reviewed the complaint and said they lacked sufficient first-hand detail to take it further. A park worker confirmed that the sensors had been malfunctioning that evening. Andrew, unwilling to wait, had simply decided that the detour wasn't something he needed to bother with. Critics asked the question that kept coming up every time one of these stories surfaced. Is there a different set of rules operating behind the gates of these estates? Because what happened that night wasn't just impatience. It was the act of someone who looked at a rule designed for everyone and decided it wasn't designed for him. And the pattern didn't stay outside. It came indoors too. Picture the grounds of Royal Lodge on a crisp autumn morning. Staff moving quietly around the property, heads down, focused on their work. Gardeners tending to newly planted saplings along the outer edges of the estate, following instructions, staying out of sight the way staff learn to do when they've been around long enough to understand the rhythms of the household. These were not careless workers. They were experienced, trusted members of a team that had served the royal family for years. The kind of people who don't need supervision because they already know what they're doing. The front door of the lodge swung open without warning. Andrew came out already in mid-sentence, voice raised, pointing, demanding to know what had been done to his trees. The gardener at the center of it stood there taking the full weight of his anger, not because she had done anything wrong, but because Andrew had decided something wasn't right and someone had to absorb it. Witnesses who were present said it went well beyond a firm complaint. It was disproportionate. It was humiliating. It was the kind of public dressing down that leaves a mark not just on the person receiving it, but on everyone in earshot. This happened, it must be said, during one of the most pressurized legal periods of Andrew's life. Civil allegations connected to his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein's network were moving through the courts. Documents had been served. The walls were closing in from a direction that had nothing to do with the garden. Insiders were willing to acknowledge that his stress levels during this period were extraordinarily high. But stress, however real, does not change the fundamental question of why an experienced, blameless gardener ended up in tears because of the way she was spoken to. She had served the royal family loyally for years. She eventually stopped working at Royal Lodge, though she continued elsewhere. Andrew never, by any account, acknowledged what he had done. Which brings us to Charlotte Briggs. Because if you want to understand the atmosphere inside Royal Lodge at the level of daily life, Charlotte's account is one of the most detailed and telling on record. Charlotte was 21 years old when she worked as a maid in Andrew's household. 21. Still finding her footing in the adult world, having taken a job in what must have seemed like an extraordinary place to work. She was not yet old enough to have developed the thick skin that long-term royal staff often describe cultivating as a matter of survival. On one particular day, she was given an instruction. Go upstairs and close the heavy curtains in one of the upper rooms. Andrew was sitting nearby, well within reach of the task, but the instruction went to Charlotte. She went up. 4 flights of stairs. She closed the curtains. But when she came back down, she had left what Andrew considered an unacceptable gap between the drapes. A small gap. The kind of thing that most people, even the most meticulous, would note and fix quietly. Andrew did not fix it quietly. He rounded on her with the kind of ferocity that, by every account of those who witnessed or experienced it, was wildly out of proportion. Can't you effing do anything right? She left the room in tears. Charlotte later told her story publicly, describing it in language that was precise and damning. He threw his weight around. He made ordinary domestic tasks into exercises in public humiliation. She pointed out the particular irony that a man decorated for military service, a man who had flown in active combat, seemed genuinely incapable of crossing a room to draw his own curtains, but was entirely capable of reducing a 21-year-old to tears for not drawing them correctly. The contradiction is jarring, and it tells you something important about how Andrew understood the people who worked for him. They were not people, they were functions. And when the function failed, even slightly, even innocuously, the response was punishment. Security and protection staff described the identical dynamic. A brief hold at a gate while visitors were being processed. A minor scheduling delay. The kind of small logistical friction that is completely unavoidable in any operation involving a large household and a moving schedule. For most people in Andrew's position, a brief wait is just a brief wait. For Andrew, it was apparently an offense serious enough to warrant shouting from the window of his car at the officers below, calling them effing buffoons, letting everyone present know exactly how far their competence fell short of what he required. Former protection officers spoke about these incidents with a weariness that suggested they had long since stopped being surprised. The palace's structure, its centuries-old hierarchy of deference, meant there was nowhere to take a complaint. Verbal abuse in a modern workplace carries consequences. In Andrew's orbit, it carried nothing. Because at the top of that hierarchy sat the Queen, and Andrew, as her most openly favored son, had for years operated in a space where accountability was more theoretical than real. And here's something worth pausing on, because the behavior we've been describing so far, the shouting, the entitlement, the treatment of staff as shock absorbers for his moods, all of it existed in a context. Andrew was not just an irritable private citizen throwing his weight around at home. He held a public role, a significant one. In 2001, he was appointed the UK's Special Representative for International Trade and Investment. It was a role that came with real access, real influence. Andrew was expected to use his royal status and his connections to open doors for British business, to smooth diplomatic relationships, to represent the country in rooms where representation mattered. Parliament members questioned the appointment from the beginning. Critics who watched his track record closely asked whether his temperament and judgment were suited to a role that required exactly the qualities he most consistently failed to demonstrate: patience, discretion, an ability to read a room and respond to it rather than demand it respond to him. But the appointment went ahead, and Andrew held it for a decade. During that time, he cultivated relationships with figures including Ilham Aliyev, the long-standing president of Azerbaijan, a country that international observers have consistently identified for corruption and the systematic suppression of political opposition. Andrew visited frequently. The access his royal status provided opened doors that other diplomats could not unlock through conventional channels. He was also linked to Libyan arms dealers and to officials connected to the Tunisian government during the 2011 revolution, a period of extraordinary political volatility. Some observers argued that Andrew wielded genuine influence through these relationships. Others suggested he simply didn't understand the weight of what he was walking into, treating official trips as luxurious paid travel, while the geopolitical consequences played out around him. Neither reading is reassuring. In 2013, he was elected to the Royal Society, the UK's oldest and most prestigious scientific institution, founded in 1660. Andrew holds A levels in history, English, and economics. He never attended university, joining the Royal Navy instead. His election drew immediate vocal outrage from members who felt the appointment bypassed every standard of merit the institution was supposed to uphold. Some attempted formally to challenge it. He remained a fellow. The episode was a small but crystalline example of the way royal status can function as a passkey to spaces that exist, in theory, to reward expertise and achievement rather than heredity. Now, before we go further into the connections that would define the darkest chapter of Andrew's public life, I want to make sure you're locked in, because what comes next is the part that most people have only heard pieces of. If this is the kind of deep dive storytelling you're here for, hit subscribe and turn on notifications right now, because there is a lot more on this channel and you do not want to miss what's coming. The name Jeffrey Epstein has become synonymous with one of the most disturbing criminal networks in modern history. A financier of murky origin and enormous wealth, Epstein ran an operation that prosecutors and investigators described as a systematic, organized effort to traffic and abuse underage girls over the course of decades. He was convicted in 2008 and served a 13-month sentence that critics, law enforcement officials, and victims' advocates widely condemned as absurdly lenient. He was a registered sex offender. His crimes were a matter of public record, and Andrew kept seeing him anyway. The friendship between Andrew and Epstein dated back to the early 1990s, introduced through Ghislaine Maxwell, the British socialite who would later be convicted of sex trafficking. Over the following 2 decades, Andrew attended social events at Epstein's various properties, including his Manhattan townhouse, one of the most expensive private residences in New York City. He was photographed at Epstein's Palm Beach estate. He traveled, he stayed, He remained, by every available account, a willing and regular presence in Epstein's world even after the 2008 conviction. In 2010, 2 years after Epstein had been sentenced, Andrew visited him in New York and was photographed walking through Central Park alongside him. For the palace, those photographs were catastrophic. For Andrew, they appeared to cause something closer to inconvenience. Sarah Ferguson, who had been living alongside Andrew at Royal Lodge since 2014 despite their divorce years earlier, reportedly urged him to stay away from Epstein's private island in the Caribbean. Whether that advice was taken remains a matter of dispute. What is not disputed is that the friendship continued, visibly and without apparent concern for what it communicated to the outside world. Lawyers representing victims of Epstein's network pursued Andrew for over a decade. Virginia Giuffre, one of Epstein's most prominent accusers, alleged that she had been trafficked and abused and that Andrew was involved. She provided a photograph showing Andrew with his arm around her waist when she was a teenager. Andrew denied everything. He denied meeting her. He denied any wrongdoing. And he eventually settled a civil lawsuit brought by Giuffre in 2022, paying a reported sum understood to be in the millions, without admitting liability. The settlement came after the single most consequential television appearance of Andrew's life. In November 2019, following Epstein's death in a New York jail cell that August under circumstances that generated immediate and widespread suspicion, Andrew sat down with Emily Maitlis for a BBC Newsnight interview. The interview was Andrew's idea. His team believed it would allow him to address the allegations directly, present himself as a credible and cooperative figure, and put the controversy behind him. What followed was something quite different. The interview ran for approximately 50 minutes. Maitlis asked her questions with precision and without the deference that palace aides had perhaps hoped for. Andrew answered in ways that left viewers, journalists, and legal observers across the world struggling to process what they were hearing. When asked about the photograph with Giuffre, he suggested it might have been doctored. When pressed on why he had continued to associate with Epstein after the 2008 conviction, he offered that it had seemed like the right thing to do to end the friendship in person, and that staying at Epstein's New York mansion for 4 days while doing so had simply been a convenient arrangement. And then came the moment that became a cultural landmark in its own right. Andrew claimed he could not have been with Giuffre on the evening in question because he had been at a Pizza Express restaurant in the town of Woking, attending a birthday party for one of his daughter's friends. He remembered it clearly, he said, because Pizza Express was an unusual destination for a member of the royal family, and the specificity of the memory had stayed with him. The internet, the press, and the general public did not know quite how to respond to the Pizza Express alibi. It was so specific, so strangely mundane, that it had a quality of either genius or catastrophe about it. Almost universally, it was received as the latter. He also offered a medical defense regarding the sweating visible in the photograph. He claimed he had suffered a condition following his service in the Falklands that had, for a period, made it impossible for him to perspire normally. Therefore, he said, the sweat visible in the image could not be his. Medical professionals questioned the claim publicly within hours. The interview was broadly considered to be one of the most damaging self-inflicted public relations disasters in modern British history. Senior advisors to the royal family reportedly described it in those terms privately. Andrew stepped back from royal duties within days. Charities and organizations affiliated with him began severing ties almost immediately. Sponsors followed. The University of Huddersfield, of which Andrew had been chancellor, announced it would not renew his appointment. The fallout was swift, significant, and, many observers noted, entirely of his own making. But the controversies were not confined to Epstein. Andrew's private life carried its own separate ledger of questionable decisions. In 2014, he became embroiled in a dispute over a £13 million ski chalet in Verbier, Switzerland, purchased jointly with Sarah Ferguson. The property was extraordinary. Sitting in one of the most prestigious ski resorts in Europe, it was the kind of acquisition that raises eyebrows simply by existing on a royal family member's balance sheet, let alone when the details of the purchase begin to emerge. Andrew was reportedly expected to contribute £5 million in cash toward the deal. Reports suggested he struggled to meet this obligation, and the chalet's owner, convinced the couple were in genuine financial difficulty, agreed to reduce the outstanding debt as an act of goodwill. Shortly afterward, Ferguson purchased a £5 million property in Mayfair. The optics were, at minimum, difficult. Rumors surfaced that Andrew had seriously considered approaching the Queen directly to ask her to settle the remaining debt on the chalet. That request, if it was ever genuinely contemplated, never materialized. But the episode illustrated something about Andrew's relationship with money, privilege, and consequence that felt deeply familiar to anyone who had followed his career. When a problem arose, the instinct was not to solve it through conventional means. It was to reach for status, to call in a favor, to find someone above him who could make it disappear. Developer David Rowland, a close friend and long-term ally, managed significant portions of Andrew's financial affairs through a private bank in Luxembourg that observers noted for its association with tax-efficient structures. Andrew reportedly borrowed millions from Rowland's institution over the years. Rowland, a major donor to the Conservative Party, cultivated an extensive network of high-profile international clients, leveraging Andrew's royal access and his role as trade representative to facilitate meetings with diplomats, politicians, and business figures across multiple continents. The lines between personal loyalty, financial arrangement, and official duty dissolved so thoroughly that it became nearly impossible to say where one ended and the next began. Critics who tracked Andrew's behavior across decades noted something that appeared in his private conduct just as reliably as it appeared in his public controversies. A tendency not just toward anger or entitlement, but toward something that looked, in its quietest moments, like contempt. Charlotte Briggs recalled the day Andrew's Norfolk Terrier, a dog named Bendix after Sarah Ferguson's favorite brand of chocolates, bit her leg. The dog had been startled by the sound of a vacuum cleaner and reacted sharply enough to rip through Charlotte's tights and draw blood. She needed a tetanus injection from Andrew's personal physician. She was in pain. She was shaken. The whole household knew what had happened. Andrew laughed. Not a nervous laugh. Not the uncomfortable chuckle of someone who doesn't know what to say in an awkward moment. A genuine, amused laugh. As if the sight of a young woman bleeding from a dog bite was one of the more entertaining things he had encountered that week. Charlotte said his leg turned purple, but his sense of humor stayed intact throughout. A separate witness, speaking to a regional newspaper, recalled Andrew making a deeply inappropriate remark to a pregnant woman at a social gathering, then laughing with the kind of loud, self-congratulatory satisfaction of someone who considers himself witty. The woman stood in visible shock. Andrew appeared not to notice, or not to care. These were not slips. They were not moments of poor judgment brought on by stress or drink or circumstance. They were glimpses of a man who found the discomfort of people with less power than him, at minimum, unremarkable, and at maximum, funny. By the time Andrew traveled to the United States in 2011 in his capacity as special trade representative, the stories about his conduct inside royal households had been circulating in whisper networks for years. Embassy staff and officials who worked alongside him during that visit described an experience that confirmed everything those whispers had suggested and then pushed it further. His role was diplomatic. He was there to represent British interests, to present a face of the country that was professional, measured, and trustworthy. What he gave them instead was this. He snapped at staff over minor scheduling adjustments. He erupted at logistical hiccups so small that other members of the delegation barely registered them. When the level of service fell below what he considered acceptable, he made sure everyone in the room knew about it, loudly and without apparent concern for who was listening. Sources who were present described his manner not as the product of a bad day or an unusually difficult trip, but as his default setting. The way he always was. The way people around him had learned to expect. When the accounts leaked to the press, the coverage was damaging and pointed. Commentators and political figures asked aloud how a man of this temperament had been given a role requiring exactly the qualities he lacked. The damage to his reputation, already strained by the Epstein association, deepened further. And for those inside the palace who had spent years managing the fallout from Andrew's behavior in private, the public confirmation of what they already knew carried a particular kind of exhausted inevitability. Because the thing about the pattern, the cumulative weight of 15 moments laid end to end, is that it doesn't leave room for the explanation that any one of them is an aberration, a stress-driven outburst, a bad morning, a momentary lapse in someone who is otherwise entirely different. The gardener, the maid, the park gates, the embassy staff, the Newsnight interview, the ski chalet, the financial arrangements, the Epstein friendship, the Royal Society, the laughter at a bleeding young woman. None of them stand alone. All of them point in the same direction. Former members of his household described working for Andrew in language that was remarkably consistent regardless of when they served or what their role had been. Walking on eggshells, never knowing when the next eruption would come. Learning over time to anticipate his moods, to position themselves carefully, to absorb what came when the positioning failed. One former helper, speaking to a journalist in terms that stayed in print for years afterward, described the experience as feeling like a human punching bag, absorbing every outburst while pretending nothing had happened. That phrase landed because it didn't sound like exaggeration. It sounded like the precise, accurate description of a working environment that nobody had bothered to fix, because fixing it would have required holding accountable a man whose position made accountability optional. And that, perhaps, is the most troubling layer of everything we've covered today. Not just that Andrew behaved the way he did, but that the system around him, the palace, the hierarchy, the inherited deference of centuries, allowed it, encouraged it even, by ensuring that the cost of his behavior was always borne by someone else. The maid, the gardener, the park worker, the embassy staff, the young woman who needed a tetanus shot and got a laugh instead. Every story that has made it out of those walls over the years arrives carrying the same question underneath it. How many more are still in there? How many people walked away from Royal Lodge, or from a diplomatic posting, or from a meeting in a Luxembourg boardroom with a version of this story they've never told? How many decided the risk wasn't worth it? How many calculated, correctly, that the institution would protect him and leave them exposed? With every leak, every quiet confession, every account that eventually found its way to a journalist or a courtroom or a camera, the picture becomes harder to look away from. And the questions inside the palace grow heavier, because the answers, when they eventually arrive, tend not to arrive quietly. So what do you think is still being hidden? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because I want to know what you make of all of this. Every comment gets read. And if this kind of story is what you came here for, make sure you like this video, share it with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe if you haven't already, because the stories on this channel are only going to get deeper from here.